I am so excited to introduce our speakers for today, our lunch and learn on the housing crisis in Rhode Island. We have with us Shana Crandell and Tom Wayman from Reclaim Rhode Island, who've been doing some excellent organizing and policy work to address Rhode Island's housing crisis. So Shana and Tom, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Autumn. Thanks to the AFL-CIO and to the Institute for Labor Studies and Research for having us. We're really excited to be here to be building the relationship between the labor movement and the tenant movement in Rhode Island. So thanks for having us. I will share my screen. So centerpiece of housing crisis is cost burdened. And when we talk about cost burdened, we're looking at someone spending 30% or more of their income on housing costs. So here we have some stats about cost burden among renters in Rhode Island. And we can see here that of the lowest income renters in Rhode Island, fully half are severely cost burdened, meaning they're spending more than half of their income on housing costs. But we can see that across from the lowest income up to the middle that folks are spending, like a majority of folks are spending more than 30% on housing, and large numbers more than half of their income on. So here we've got, right, for a long time, this housing crisis has been devastating the lowest income folks, and that's gotten significantly worse since the pandemic. But the housing crisis is not just affecting the poorest Rhode Islanders, right? It's all the way up through middle income folks as well. And another kind of picture of the housing crisis in Rhode Island is where in Rhode Island it's affordable to rent. So where someone making the median income of $38,000, there's only one municipality in Rhode Island where they can rent a 2-bedroom affordably. And folks making less than $30,000, there's not a single municipality in Rhode Island where they're able to rent a 2-bedroom affordably. So that's a kind of big overview of the housing crisis, right? With folks not being able to afford rent costs, that leads to eviction and displacement, and as consequences of these, absolutely out of control housing costs. So we're mostly going to focus on our strategy to fight the housing crisis. I think probably all of us are pretty familiar with how it affects our day-to-day lives with these skyrocketing costs. And our strategy fighting the housing crisis really has 2 prongs, and I'm going to speak about one, and Tom will speak about the other. So the first is a kind of bottom-up power building. So for the last year and a half, we've been organizing slumlord tenants. And when we're organizing tenants, we're organizing folks to fight directly against their landlords, and also organizing tenants and the public to fight for tenant protections, so new legislation to protect tenants. And the second prong of our housing crisis strategy is to empower the state to build mixed income housing or social housing. And that's the piece that Tom's going to talk about in a few minutes. And for my piece, I will jump into this first part of our strategy of organizing tenants. So here's an image of us at the State House earlier this year. Tom, when he gets into sort of the future of social housing that we're fighting for, and how social housing can kind of fundamentally change the landscape. The first prong of our strategy really looks at the present reality, which is slumlords, right? So much of our naturally occurring affordable housing, or affordable housing that's not by policy design, is slum housing. Slumlords, right, just as a kind of overview of what the experience of slum housing is for folks. Slumlords prey on already vulnerable people, so folks who are recently homeless, folks coming out of incarceration, people with evictions on your records or bad credit, or just plain hardworking, plain working all the damn time for folks. So slumlords know that their targets are desperate. They know that a lot of folks will have to put up with the conditions or else just leave. So there's few or no alternatives, and there's a huge amount of retaliation by slumlords against tenants who do try to fight individually for better living conditions. So increasingly, slumlords are investment corporations with lots of properties spread out across the state. So we've seen this kind of consolidation of slum housing in recent years as well, which has intensified a lot of the problems. So we see these investors snapping up already depressed properties and then grinding people through the eviction machine while these properties rot, right? So this is the reality of slum housing in Rhode Island. Folks are facing a choice between homelessness and putting up with unlivable conditions. So I first wanted to kind of talk about why organize slumlord tenants. Why did this become the centerpiece of our strategy? And the first reason is the egregiousness of the harms that slumlords perpetrate. So this is poor housing conditions and insecure tenancy, meaning at any point you could have 30 days to be out of your home, to lose your home. So insecure tenancy and poor conditions really ripple throughout people's lives. So frequently, slumlord tenants that we talk to describe living in slum housing as psychological torture. Right, so the combination of deteriorating conditions in the home, harassment by the landlord, and uncertainty of whether you'll have a place to stay 30 days from now. That combination is so often person after person really describes that as a kind of torture. So that's a moral reason to fight slumlords. But there's another organizing reason why to fight slumlords, which is that there's a lot of ways that we can win. So there's a lot of underutilized tools that exist right now that organizing can leverage to win for these tenants. And that there's a lot of unenforced and unimplemented laws already on the books that organizing can actualize, can make real for people. So we have a lot of existing protections, but they often go sort of unused. In other words, what these slumlords are doing to tenants is already illegal according to the laws we have. Slumlords get away with it because of fear of retaliation and fear of homelessness, which keeps people atomized and separated from each other, alongside enforcement and implementation structures that are either weak or non-existent. So the kind of shining example in our work of how organizing can bridge this gap between the laws we have on the books on the one hand, right, and the reality on the ground of how slumlords are exploiting people, is the prosecution this June by the Attorney General of our first target slumlord, which was Pioneer Investments. So we had just never seen the Attorney General go after a slumlord with this kind of breadth. And that was possible through organizing. So now I want to touch on just some kind of tactics that we use in our tenant organizing to get wins. So you might immediately think of the rent strike as the main tool of tenant organizers. The rent strike is as long as non-payment of rent is a ground for legal eviction, it's an extremely risky tactic. So for now, that kind of tactic is not on the table for us. We also in Rhode Island have very small buildings compared to other places where rent strikes have been really effective. So we're typically 6 units or fewer, whereas in many cities, you're dealing with buildings with hundreds of units, right? And that's a very different kind of organizing landscape where rent strike might make more sense. But we do have kind of limited legal rent strikes that we can use, especially with a new law we have around lead protections, right? So we helped win a law that allows tenants to pay their rent into an escrow account if their landlord doesn't have a lead certificate, or if their landlord has existing lead hazards in the home, like chipping paint. And that's a way for tenants to now be able to legally not pay their rent to the landlord, and the landlord is not allowed to evict them for non-payment once that petition is granted, right? So once it's clear that the landlord has existing lead hazards or has failed to get a lead safety certificate, the tenants are able to engage in a kind of limited rent strike that doesn't carry that risk of legal eviction. I also want to point to just a couple of other forms of collective action that are at a kind of smaller scale than a rent strike, but can be really powerful. So eviction defense, right? Kind of nationally, about 90% of landlords have a lawyer and only 10% of tenants do. So empowering each other to fight every eviction with legal services is a huge blow to these slumlords and a form of collective action that is a huge part of our work. So just fighting back against every single slumlord eviction instead of just folding, taking bogus numbers that slumlords bring into court. I'll just do a couple more examples of the kind of collective action and tactics that we use. Tenants have a tool to fight back against the landlord who, for example, cuts off their heat or cuts off water. And that's to file a restraining order, which forces the landlord to turn the heat back on or to turn the water back on, et cetera. These are a hugely time-consuming process that you have to know how to do, right? You have to be able to drive to the district court. You have to request a certain kind of form to not pay court fees. You have to go in front of the judge and do X, Y, Z. And you have to drive to the sheriff and serve right. It's this whole drawn-out process that ordinary individuals by themselves are unlikely to know about or to carry out. And that's something that we, in the tenant union, empower each other to do. So I'm gonna kind of leave some details. If people have questions about other tactics that we use, I'm happy to talk more about that in the questions. But for now, I'll kind of just keep going so I can pass it to Tom. Here's just some images of us, rallies, canvassing, and at eviction court. So last, before I pass it over to Tom, I'll just touch on the legislative side of what we do. So some of what we do is organizing folks to win tenant protections. And so 3 big things that we won in the last session that our tenant union helped win was the ban of rental application fees. So landlords can no longer, it was this huge racket that was, just well known among tenants, but somehow allowed to stand, that landlords were able to charge application fees, often, $50 per adult. That's now over with, thanks to that law. Tenants now also have the right to seal an eviction record once in 5 years. And finally, lead hazard protection. So I already mentioned that lead escrow law, which gives tenants a whole new set of protections and tools to fight back against negligent landlords. And going forward, priorities, rent control, rental registry is a basis for rent control. This is coming up and was just introduced in Providence. It is hugely important for these other pro-tenant measures to get off the ground. And finally, good cause eviction, right? So you can't be kicked out of your home in 30 days for no reason, or even because your landlord raises the rent too quickly and you can't keep up. You can't be kicked out for that. So going forward, these are kind of legislative priorities that we will be organizing around. Okay, and here's some images of us testifying at the State House for those laws. Okay, with that, Tom, I'm going to pass it over to you and we'll do questions on everything at the end. So thanks, everybody.
Cool. Hey, thanks, Shana. Thanks, everybody, for having us today. I'm Tom Wayman, organizer at Reclaim Rhode Island. Most of the work I've done has been around electoral work, but recently have also been getting involved in the legislative work, particularly around housing and tenant rights. So yeah, Shane, if you want to go to the next slide. So, we all know there's a housing crisis, and we see that affordable housing is not being developed in Rhode Island. And so let's talk about why that is. So private development is not financially incentivized to build affordable housing because it's just not as profitable as building a luxury affordable units is being done in exchange for tax credits. And it's good that these affordable units are being built, but because they're tied to these tax credits, which are limited the amount that's available every year, we're just not seeing a lot of affordable units being built. Also, a lot of the private development is 1-bedroom apartments. They're not suitable for families. And we also see an issue with the tax credits where they have essentially an expiration date. So affordable unit may be affordable when the building is first built, but that will expire after 20 or 30 years or something like that. And then those apartments can then be rented at the market rate. We see the nonprofits and community development corporations who are doing really incredible work building affordable housing, but they are also limited by the tax credits. They are relying on those to get these projects built, and then are also just limited by their own capacity, whether it's to get financing for projects or just their own staff capacity to handle a lot of projects. So they are building affordable units, but just not at the rate that we need. And then we have our public housing, which in Rhode Island, across the country, there's been a real lack of investment from the federal government, the housing department, from HUD around building new public housing. A lot of the focus has shifted to Section 8, and then also there's been drastic underfunding in the repair and rehabilitation of existing public housing. And that leads to units that are just vacant because they're in such poor condition that they can't be rented. And then, as Shana just talked about, we have our slumlords who have this cheap housing that they are not financially incentivized to maintain. So there's poor conditions, mold, lead, vermin infestations, stuff like that. So essentially, again, as Shana talked about, being a landlord is that business is almost essentially unregulated, just because the departments of inspection and standards, code enforcement, stuff like that are either underfunded, under-resourced, not paying attention, or tenants fear retaliation. There's all these reasons why the housing is neglected. We could move on to the next slide, Shana. At Reclaim, we've been excited about this model for building new affordable housing, and it's called social housing. So what is social housing? Social housing is publicly owned, like the public housing that we have here in Rhode Island. But key difference is that it is mixed income. So you have people that are of all incomes that are living in the same building. And we'll get into a bit more about the way that works financially in a second, but that means essentially people that are paying market rent are helping subsidize the affordable units in the same building. Social housing can be built without relying on tax credits. This is key because, again, the tax credits that are available every year are very limited, so this will help get more housing built faster. Social housing is green housing. In Rhode Island, a few years ago, we passed the Act on Climate, which means all new buildings that are built by the state are going to need to have strong environmental regulations. Social housing is built with union labor, and this is huge, right? Most of the housing projects in Rhode Island are not built with union labor, so we're really excited to have union jobs for this housing. And then also this development can be counter-cyclical, again, because of the way that it's funded, because it's being built by the state. This development can happen in times of recession. Typically we see when unemployment rates go up, the amount of construction projects goes down. This can be a countervailing force to that, and lead to more jobs in tough times. If we could go to the next slide, Shana. This idea of social housing is being explored all over the country, but where it's most famously been implemented is in Montgomery County, Maryland. This building here is called the Laureate. It was recently completed, and this follows all these examples of a new public housing project that is available to people of all incomes. And so in Montgomery County, it's been a really great example of how social housing can be implemented when there's the political will to make it happen. It's beautiful housing, it's for all people, and it's owned and developed, in this case, by the county. And so when we talk about how this works financially, that could be a really long discussion, but there was an article last month in the New York Times that I think really neatly sums up how this financing model can work. So I'm going to read a couple paragraphs from that. When a developer builds a project, and this is just like any housing project, it typically teams up with a private equity firm that puts up about a third of the cost. The rest comes from a bank loan. They want a return, however, and the money isn't cheap. The going annual rate in private equity is in the mid to high teens. It can be like 15 to 18%. A $50 million investment, for example, is expected to return about $90 million after 4 years, money that is made up for with rent. In 2021, the Montgomery County Council voted to create the $100 million Housing Production Fund. The fund allows the Housing Opportunities Commission, which is the county's version of a public housing authority, to replace private equity as developers' main source of investment and charge a 5% return, so 5% instead of 18%. The discount saves the developer tens of millions of dollars off the project's effective cost. There are, of course, conditions. The HOC demands that projects built with the Housing Production Fund have a higher share of below market rate units and deeper affordability than what is currently being built. Most of the time, developers in Montgomery County set aside units for people earning 65 to 70% of the area's median income. Some of the units at the Laureate, however, are available to families that earn less than 50%. The developer, in this case a construction company, still makes money. It gets a fee for overseeing the project, and because the HOC projects are exempt from property taxes, and because it is willing to take a low rate of return, the building can profitably operate with double the normal number of affordable units. So, we see here there's a few factors that lower the cost of building this housing, right? Because there's this housing production fund, they can loan the money cheaper than private equity can. The combination of being exempt from property taxes, and then also because it's not privately owned and trying to make a profit, that can lower the cost of the rent. And so that's kind of like a shining example of how this can work. If we could skip to the next slide. Shana. So what could June Speakman introduced a bill that we helped create, 6168, and created a $15 revolving fund to housing production by the Department of Housing in Rhode Island and local public housing authorities. So with this $50 million, that money would get loaned out and returned to the fund every 4 to 5 years, which means for a 20-year bond, it creates between $200 and $250 million for housing production. This bill was co-sponsored by Speaker Joe Shekarchi, and it had written testimony in support from the AFL-CIO, Building Trades, the Painters Union, Climate Jobs Rhode Island, the Providence and Pawtucket Public Housing Authorities, and many others. So this is a way that this social housing could happen in Rhode Island. The bill did not pass last session. It generated a lot of interest, obviously, and we think momentum is growing to do this. And if it happens, Rhode Island would be the first state in the nation to have a public developer of social housing. Next slide, Shana, please. So, what's next? What are the next steps? The Department of Housing is funding a study on the state of public housing in Rhode Island. Again, we know that there are a lot of issues with buildings that are in desperate need of repair, and we know that there is interest from housing authorities in building new housing. So this study is going to look at all of that and create a report that should be done by the end of the year, which will also explore ways that social housing can be implemented in Rhode Island, and also other ways that might be possible to build new public housing. we have been engaged in talks with the Department of Housing, with the speaker, with unions and public housing authorities, just continuing the discussion about social housing and how it can be implemented in Rhode Island. And then looking towards next session, we're hoping, of course, to get this bond introduced and to be on the ballot next November for the election. And we're hoping that in addition to funding the housing production revolving fund, to also have money available to public housing authorities to fund repairs.
So we do a huge amount of door knocking. So we determine in advance, which buildings are owned by various slumlords, and we just begin by asking questions about people's experience, and then connecting them with neighbors who have perhaps fought off an eviction, or who have filed a TRO, or who have been to housing court to take on their landlords for conditions violations, right? But we just begin with an organizing conversation based in what the effects of slum housing have been for that person and that household. And typically people are very eager to be involved, and people are, at the end of their rope in a lot of cases, and just kind of have been perhaps attempting on their own already, and realize that alone it's extremely risky, and are very excited for the opportunity to be able to do it in a collective way that mitigates some of the risks and binds us together. So
do you find like one common complaint or issue that tenants in Rhode Island are experiencing within their homes?
Mold to like an unlivable extent, like not just visibly noticeable mold, but people would be taking their kids to sleep somewhere else because has such impacts on health, on asthma, coughing, so just like a lot of health issues that sort of spring out from bad plumbing, walls without integrity, and a huge amount of mold.
I have a quick question. On the landlord side of things, how do legislative updates get to landlords? Like, is it just I educate myself as a landlord if I care enough, or is that because you said it's not regulated? So how do updates travel up to them?
A kind of an example of how that can happen is with the upcoming rental registry. So in the last session, we did win a statewide rental registry. It will likely not include all of the information that we ultimately want a rental registry to include, like rent prices, conditions issues, code violations, that kind of thing. But this, a law that passed, it goes into effect on January 1st. Landlords will be receiving many notices and deadlines to come into compliance with the new rental registry law. But another sort of way that we're going to make sure landlords are becoming aware of this is to just help tenants use their new rights. So now that we have this new right to go into the court and say, because of lead hazards or because of major conditions issues, I need to pay into the court, right? The landlord is going to be unable to file an eviction without addressing those issues, without getting a valid lead certificate, right? So there will be some notice from top down, right? So from like state and from agencies, but then there's also going to be notice from the bottom up, because we'll be making sure that everybody knows they can use this new right to kind of pressure their landlord to make repairs.
I have a question. This is something that I have experienced where I'm not sure, since the COVID, I lived through a place where they have changed many landlords over the time. But in the last couple of years since COVID, what I have been experiencing is I think it comes from those who work in the office as property manager where I get a email and my property manager will say your rent is going to be increased within 30 days by 400. So that is something that I have struggled with. So at one point I had a 400 increase into my rent. I have continually, making half of my income to be paid towards two-bedroom apartment. And one of the things the property manager has said to me was that that's what they have to do because the cost of maintaining their property has increased. So they have been charged with many unexpected payments. So what as a tenant, what is my right into that? At what point can a landlord increase your rent, and at what percentage? Is this something they can just get up and say, today I'm going to increase your rent by 500, by 1,000? At that point, you're not prepared to go looking for another place. So it just creates that kind of feeling where you don't know what to do. So is there any advice from you, Shana, as to, because if it should happen again, what can I do? What's my right? What other steps can I take to challenge the landlord that this is not right? I don't know. Any advice on that?
Thanks, Sunny. So unfortunately, landlords at this point are allowed to raise the rent by however much they want with only 30 days notice in most cases. So this is the kind of totally unregulated side of things, where there's really no limit on how much those rents can go up. Now, there is some instances where a tenant can fight back against rent increases. For example, if you have called code or complained and the landlord has fixed something in response to your complaints or in response to code enforcement requiring the landlord to make complaints, the landlord is not in that case allowed to turn around and raise your rent. That's retaliation. So that's if the massive rent increase comes after a request for repairs, right? Because you mentioned, right, landlords say, oh, it's costing so much to maintain the properties, right? And if you're requesting that the landlord maintain the property and keep things up to minimum standards, and then they turn around and raise the rent, that is something you can contest. And so there's kind of two sides. On the one side, right, we've got to win rent controls, right? Because landlords are at this point totally unrestrained in how much they can charge for rent. And then second, to whenever possible, to fight back on grounds of retaliation, because landlords retaliate pretty rampantly.
And say every year, Shannon, because one of the experiences is that do they have certain amount of time frame to increase rent? This all started happening in my case after COVID, because the property that I live in, they were very supportive. They maintain the property, and there was no every year increase. And then this new company take over, and then we have this new office manager, and it's every year. So right now, as I'm setting my lease will be over by June, so I'm not sure what she's gonna come up with.
The only time there's a limit is if you're in a long-term lease agreement. So a landlord can't raise your rent during that long-term lease agreement. But again, most or a very large percentage of Rhode Islanders are in month-to-month rental agreements, right? In which case there's not even that year limit, right? You don't even have to go through the whole year lease before the landlord can raise the rent. So again, everything you're saying is pointing to just how badly we need rent control to sort of rein in this problem. Tom, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just also wanted to mention there was a bill last session to increase the amount of time a landlord has to give you. Right now the law is 30 days, and this bill was introduced by Representative Jen Stewart in the House, and TR Mack had a bill in the Senate, and it would have increased the amount of time from 30 days to 120 days. There was a lot of pushback, as you might imagine, from landlords, and they were trying to negotiate a compromise to find a shorter amount of time, but the bill did not end up passing this session. But I think that's certainly a huge priority for us for next session, just because it is one of these things that makes so much sense. You mentioned only having 30 days. This happened to a friend of mine where his rent went from $800 one month to $1,400 the next month, and he had 30 days, and he had to pay that increase until he was able to find a more affordable place to live. So in addition to rent control or rent stabilization, that's another huge priority for us next session.
I also want to note that someone has their hand raised. So Kirk Robinson, if you want to ask your question, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks. Thank you for putting this on. This has been really informative. I had some questions about the bill. This, I think it's 6168. Without maybe getting too far into the weeds, and maybe this is I guess it's a clarifying question, and then maybe a more in the weeds question. So like for public housing, is there like a stipulation in the bill that would prevent public housing from being subject to like the market? So because like that's the kind of the contradiction I'm seeing there with like something like that without having rent control. You know what I mean? Like at what point, if there's no rent control, then would public housing, like, would the rents be stable in any sort of meaningful way? Kind of just sort of to prevent the problem that I think the last person who was talking, and Tom, in reference to your friend, to prevent something like that from happening, going from 800 to 1400. Because like, I mean, and I don't know, this is me getting on my soapbox really quick, but like rent should be like 500 to 500 to 500. Actually, I mean, honestly, we shouldn't pay rent. The whole relation is completely, obscene, but I won't get into that sort of detail. But like, so yeah, for that bill, would there be provisions to prevent that sort of thing from happening in public housing? That's the question.
Sure. I don't believe there's any language in the bill that like stipulates the amount of rent or limiting the rent, but because the housing is owned by the state or public housing authority, their incentive is not to raise the rent outrageously to make a profit, right? Their incentive is to provide housing to people who need it, and also to cover the costs of maintenance and that. So I agree that there should probably be some language that kind of stipulates that more directly, but really that's kind of the key piece of why it's important that this housing is publicly owned, because it's a public service.
Thank you.
Julie, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to say that the rent control can work in conjunction with the public housing, right? That so like Montgomery County, they stabilize rents, right? And so we can fight for those two things in conjunction, so that the market rate units in the public housing are also subject to rent controls or rent stabilization.
Dealer had a question real quick. You can unmute at any point, too.
Okay, I have a question. So I have two, actually. So let's say if a tenant has mold, what are the steps that person can take? If that person has told the landlord numerous times regarding the issue, keeps paying rent on time, but yet the issue is still there. And let's say they do have kids and the kids are getting sick. So what measures can they take?
Great question. So like one thing to say is that oftentimes the experience for people is that you call code enforcement, and even if they do come out and inspect, for example, for mold, often nothing happens. So what do we do about that, right? If we have here is this agency that's supposed to be protecting us from unhealthy conditions, and even if they do come out and even if they do say, there's this leak that's causing the mold, it needs to be fixed, often that results in no action from the landlord. So one thing we've been doing is like empowering people, and sometimes buildings or multiple apartments in a building, to to scrutinize and pursue that process all the way through to housing court, right? So to be staying on top of it, where you end up with the landlord having to come in front of a municipal judge on account of those violations, right? For example, whatever leak is causing the mold, right? And in housing court, which is where landlords and homeowners go for code violations, you typically do not hear from tenants. And so this new thing that we've been doing is, okay, so our one source of help doesn't often result in anything happening. Let's all show up at housing court and tell the judge, this is the reality of living in a home with code violation. And we've had a lot of success with this tactic of, like, first of all, just like massively increasing how much the fines being levied against landlords are. Like, we had $1,000 a day in one case. We've had a judge order an immediate reinspection, right then and there, electrical inspector goes out. So if we kind of work together to pressure these agencies, we can make them work for us at least better, right? If not totally better than they do when we just call code and nothing happens.
Okay, thank you. My next question is, what is your biggest barriers that would present any delays for social housing in Rhode Island?
Yeah, sure. I think we've been working this past year on building up the support among the legislature, unions, other housing tenant organizations, and so it's really just a matter of getting the funding for it. And again, the hope is, the ideal would be a bond that is on the ballot next November that would establish the revolving fund. There are other ways to fund it, but that's financially kind of the way that makes the most sense and would lead to the most amount, the largest number of units being built.
So that's the biggest barrier, the
Yeah.
funding. Okay, thank you.
Well, we have just a few more minutes left, so if anyone's got that last burning question, now's your chance. Okay.
I have one more question, Autumn. Sorry.
Sure.
If folks want to get involved and support your work, how would you recommend they do that?
Awesome. I'm glad you asked that. If anyone wants to knock doors with us and become part of the tenant organizing, we do big group canvases about once a month where a bunch of us go either to Pawtucket, Central Falls, or West Warwick. Those are our two kind of hubs where we're trying to form regional tenant committees. If folks want to come on a group canvas, we do a training, so how to have these conversations most effectively, go out in pairs. Or if you want to just kind of join up with either me or another organizer on the campaign and knock doors independently. We're on the doors pretty much continuously, so I'd say reach out. We've got let me drop the email in the chat. We got organize@reclaimri, and we can plug you into that. Maybe I'll pass it to Tom for how folks can get involved with the more kind of legislative side of things.
Yeah, I mean, we would love your help, organizing around this. I'd say also just the email that Shana just dropped, organize@reclaimri.org. We're about to really get cooking on our legislative priorities for next session, and we'd love to have you involved in organizing with us.
Great. Well, on that note, I will be providing that information from Reclaim on how to get involved with any follow-up communications. And as we edit this recording and post it on Labor Vision, which leads me to my plug for Labor Vision. Labor Vision is the labor movement's living TV show. It lives on YouTube. You can follow and subscribe at Labor Vision TV 1 on YouTube, and you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter with Labor Vision RI, and our website is laborvisionri.org. This is a product of the Rhode Island AFL-CIO and the Institute for Labor Studies and Research, and we are so excited and happy to have had you folks here from Reclaim, and such great questions and participation from everyone involved. So we are doing these monthly. We've had two before this. This is our third, and next month we will be tackling or trying to tackle health insurance. that very easy, small subject. So I believe that we will have Secretary Treasurer Pat Crowley on to talk about health insurance, how it's negotiated for in contracts, and also why premiums might be going up and how that's going to affect you. So stay tuned for that. And thank you everybody for joining us today.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments.